I'd like to introduce Anya basically because I've known Anya for so long, but also as a way of kind of allowing folks into a little prism of our relationship in terms of, I mentioned the future of ethical societies before, but in those times, watching a person sort of become and develop into the person they've always wanted to be is an amazing experience. And so I've had a chance to witness that with Anya from at times further away than others, but I'm always impressed and honored to know her. And so here we go, introducing Anya Overmann.
Oh, thank you, Christian. That was really nice. Yes, Christian and I have known each other for the better part of a decade, I think. So much so that my parents will host him on a regular basis when he's in St. Louis when I'm not there. So yeah, he's like part of my family. All right, so I'm going to share my screen here. And just want to make sure I have it pulled up before I get started. Okay. Okay, can we see that presentation? Christian, you see that?
You can see it. It's a little zoomed in. If you can zoom out a little bit, so that it's just full. Yeah.
How's that?
It's good. It's good on this side.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to get started.
Yeah, when I make my screen.
Okay, great. So, hi, thank you for having me here today. As Christian said, I am Anya Overmann. And in light of this platform theme of change for this month, I have come here to speak to you today about the change in my life of becoming a digital nomad and a much more involved world community member. I've decided to use today as an opportunity to get pretty vulnerable in front of you and perform a self-critique around this subject matter. But before I get into that, let me provide some background story. So I was already pretty well traveled before I became a digital nomad in 2020. And for those of you who aren't so familiar with that term, a digital nomad is someone who works from a laptop as they travel nomadically, meaning they have no fixed home. So this is my very first trip out of the country when I was 18. I had just graduated from high school. My uncle, who lives in Hong Kong, flew me out to work for him and live with him for a summer. And at this point, I had my suspicions prior to leaving the US, but this first international trip really confirmed my belief that exposing myself to other cultures is a good idea, and the US not as great as I was led to believe that it was. I tried briefly to go to college in Hong Kong rather than Truman State University back in middle of nowhere, Missouri, but it was just too expensive. I also tried to go to college in Canada, but not knowing what I wanted to do made that really hard to apply for their programming. So I stayed in Missouri and I powered through my 4-year college degree in 3 years so I could come out debt-free. Then, when I graduated from college, I set my sights on moving to London. That's me in London. I worked for the first year after college in St. Louis to save up for an internship program there in London with the intention of using it as a conduit to immigrate to the UK. I applied for over 100 jobs while I was there, but was not successful and had to return to St. Louis to work. I returned to work at my St. Louis uncle's company doing marketing and teaching gymnastics, while also doing content marketing gigs on the side. Like many millennial job experiences, the money wasn't very good, and my desire to work hard and prove myself was often taken advantage of. That all came to a head in 2017 when I managed to turn a part-time gig into a full-time remote content marketing job that would enable me to work from wherever I wanted. I took that opportunity to go back to London to spend time living with my then boyfriend, Then 5 weeks into going full-time, I realized my boss is not going to pay me, and I quit. At that point, I was done working for other people. And that's when I started working for myself as a content marketing consultant and a ghostwriter. While work isn't always a certainty in this arrangement, I could always rely on myself to pay me. And around this same time, I started to become disillusioned with the cost of living in London and enamored with the idea of being able to live in many places. I read about digital nomading, and I knew immediately that that was the life for me. So I planned to build my business for several years back in St. Louis, then take off once I felt I had saved enough money. And that's what I was doing up until March 2020. When that rolled around, I had to make some tough decisions. St. Louis was not handling the pandemic well. People didn't take masking seriously at all. I was also living in a fairly dangerous neighborhood at the time where gunshots were normal to hear at night, and I got sexually harassed almost every time I left my apartment. It all became too much just a few months into the pandemic. The cultural aloofness towards the health of the greater community was weighing heavily on my anxiety. To be surrounded by people who made it so clear that they didn't care about the people in their community was not something my mental health could handle anymore. So in July 2020, my partner, who had already begun living as a digital nomad, and I decided to leave the US. I gave up my apartment, I sold my car and most of my other possessions, and we left at the end of August for Croatia. At the time, Croatia was one of the only countries open to US passport holders, and it had a national mask mandate and a low COVID case count, so it seemed like a much safer choice than anywhere in the US. I certainly wasn't planning to begin this nomadic lifestyle in the midst of a global crisis. I had really intended to build up my business for a few more years until I was comfortable. But I ended up having to prioritize my safety over my comfort. It's truly unfortunate that I left St. Louis in a rush because I felt unsafe, but I also had not felt a sense of belonging in that city for a very, very long time. So in many ways, it was a long time coming. Now, I want to talk about values. One of the 12 core values that I grew up learning at the Ethical Society of St. Louis has stuck with me through adulthood. I am part of the world community, which depends on the cooperation of all people for peace and justice. Since my childhood, the idea of being part of something greater, where everyone had to pitch in and do their part to make the world a better place, has just made sense to me. We're all here together. We have this one life and this one planet, so we should live conscientiously, aiming to make our world a better place for future generations of all life. But my travels have taught me that I have more privilege than most people on this earth. And there are a lot of marginalized people in our species. Everyone in the world falls on this scale between privilege and marginalization. With intersectionality, we can get a rough idea of where a person falls on this scale, measuring human experience in the context of their identities and the structures at play. Intersectionality is a term coined in 1989 by US American lawyer and civil rights activist, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw. She used the term to describe how race, gender, and other identities intersect or overlap. Now, on the spectrum of privilege and marginalization in the US, I'm pretty privileged. I had a good education, a decent upbringing, all my basic needs were cared for. I got presents on holidays and birthdays. I was not subjected to the indoctrination of a faith. I'm white, I'm able-bodied and healthy. really the most inhibitive thing I have going for me is my gender and my mental health struggles. I've taken some intersectional assessments, by the way, and I tend to fall in between somewhat privileged and very privileged. If you're interested, you can get a rough idea of where you are on this spectrum with an assessment called Identity Test on idrlabs.com. Now, if you look at my privilege from a global perspective, though, I have even more privilege. About 9.5% of the global population lives in extreme poverty, making less than $1.90 a day. Global poverty disproportionately affects women and young people, and it's definitely something I have witnessed on my travels. And this is hard not to think about as a young woman. I'm so lucky that I had the resources and the support to build a successful freelance business that I can do digitally as my livelihood, and a strong enough passport to move around while I do it. It probably hasn't occurred to most of us that a one-way flight is a privilege available to only a tiny minority of nationalities. That is something we in the US often take for granted when traveling. As holders of one of the strongest passports globally, we have access to most places worldwide, while many other passports come with significant barriers to travel and movement. As of 2022, US passport holders can travel to around 182 countries and territories without obtaining a visa. That makes the US passport the 8th most powerful in the world. So what does my privilege mean in the context of trying to be a better world community member? Could it be possible that my privilege gets in the way of being the best world community member I can be? Now, I've been living as a nomad for over 2 years now, and I have been to over 20 countries on 5 continents. Here on this map, you can see all the places I've been. I've spent time actually living in many of these places, not just being a tourist. I have learned and experienced so much. And like most people who have had the opportunity to travel as much as I have, I am deeply grateful. But I want to address the darker side of my travel today. Is it possible that I'm contributing to greater harms by living this way? Or put another way, am I hurting people when I travel? I'm going to get vulnerable here with you right now and dig into some of the ways I could be potentially causing harm with my travel lifestyle. My hope is that by the end of my talk today, you may feel more inspired to look within and perform a similar sort of self-critique. But first off, let me talk about something we all need to be concerned with, but travelers especially, the carbon footprint. I think we all know that air travel is terrible for the environment, and I have been using a lot of airplanes. Since I began my digital nomad life in August 2020, I have taken 39 flights. 9 of these flights were long intercontinental flights. That comes out to about 65.85 tons of CO2 emissions from flights since August 2020. Now, what does that mean? For comparison, Taylor Swift's plane made 170 flights in the first 200 days of this year alone, releasing 8,294 tons of carbon emissions into the atmosphere. You can hardly see my footprint from flights when compared to hers. Taylor's footprint is also 1,000 times the average person's annual emissions. So do I just shrug and say, oh, well, everyone has an impact on climate, and Taylor Swift's private flights have a way more negative impact on the climate than mine ever will? I don't think that kind of minimization is good world community member behavior. While there are certainly individuals with much bigger negative impacts on the environment, shrugging off my impact is shirking my responsibility to our home planet. And that's a slippery slope of a mindset to take on. This is an especially dangerous mindset to take on when you consider that those most impacted by the disastrous effects of climate change are marginalized people who are already suffering. Have you ever wondered why some people never evacuate during hurricanes or other horrible climate change fueled disasters? In many cases, it's not because they don't want to leave, it's because they can't afford to leave, or because disabilities prevent them from leaving. Some of the most marginalized people, those in poverty and those with disabilities, always suffer the most from climate change. And those with some of the smallest carbon footprints are disproportionately affected by the worst of climate change. When we look at Pakistan, for example, this country emits only 1% of the world's carbon emissions. But just a few months ago, 1/3 of the country went underwater due to unprecedented monsoon rains. But let's get back to carbon footprints. My footprint might be tiny when compared to Taylor Swift's, but what about when compared to everyone else? When we look at the US, the average carbon footprint is 16 tons of CO2 annually, which is one of the highest in the world. The global average is closer to 4 tons of CO2. Here in Peru, it's actually 3 tons. Even including all of my flights, my annual CO2 output is 8 tons. That's half the average US American's footprint, but it's still double the global average. Now, I don't own a car. I live out of a backpack and a duffel bag, and I've been mostly vegetarian for about 15 years. So that certainly helps. But I want to minimize my impact as much as I can and do my part for the planet as a world community member. How can I do better when my carbon footprint is double the global average? I found some comfort in answering this question while I was in Medellin, Colombia, during a conversation I had with a biology professor who specializes in lectures on climate change there in Medellin. We were having a cup of coffee one day in an open air cafe in a very green and lush neighborhood in Medellin. And he said to me, "The reason I decided to not have children is because of the impact a child has on the climate. The best thing the average individual can do for the environment is to have no children." As someone who already has no interest in having a child, this brought me immense relief. I understand that not having children is a sacrifice for some people, but for me, it isn't. I don't want to bring a child into a world this cruel. And I don't want to subject a child to the traumas that I am still trying to work through. Knowing that not having a child helps the climate while I contribute to the pollution of the environment with air travel makes me feel like I'm offsetting some negative climate impact by choosing not to procreate. But this is not the only solution I have found for reducing my carbon footprint. I've been using a service called REN, which allows me to calculate my carbon footprint and offset it by contributing to projects that support the climate, like planting trees, carbon removal technology, and conservation efforts. I currently pay to offset 200% of my carbon footprint each month. Now, while offsetting isn't the solution, it is something, and something is better than nothing. Also, my partner and I are hoping to eventually move aboard a sailboat and travel by means of wind and water. This would enable us to continue our travels while significantly reducing our carbon footprints. Seeking and executing these varied solutions to reduce my carbon footprint makes me confident that I'm improving as a world community member, at least on that front. Now, let's talk about another global issue that we all have to worry about, but perhaps many of us are not worrying about as much as we should. Let's talk about public health. I started traveling 5 months after the pandemic began and before vaccines were available. Now, without any additional context, I understand how this could sound incredibly irresponsible. After all, travel is how disease spreads. And I just went and ran off to travel during the most significant viral outbreak of our lifetimes. But as I explained before, I left because I was seeking a place I would feel safer, a place that was handling the pandemic better than Missouri and the rest of the US at that time. We chose to go to Dubrovnik, Croatia, because it was one of the few countries open to US passport holders. They had a national mask mandate and very low COVID case counts at that time. But when we arrived, we had a rude awakening and realized that the existence of a mask mandate does not necessitate enforcement of that law. And many people in Dubrovnik deliberately ignored the mandate. If I've learned anything over the past 2.5 years, it's that lots of people all over the world are willing to disregard calls for masking if it means they can pretend things are normal, in quotes. Learning this truth upset me for many reasons, but what upset me the most is the deeper implications behind shirking personal responsibility for public health. After vaccines were rolled out, a lot of people loosened up and decided they were done masking. There seemed to be this collective decision in many countries, the US included, that despite the science saying otherwise, mass vaccination was enough to drop masking. We know that vaccination is only a piece of the pie when it comes to minimizing viral spread. And yet, a critical mass began behaving as if vaccination was a cure-all. Many folks in our own communities have resolved to behave this way too. But I'm not here today to criticize community members. I'm here to criticize myself. My guilt as a traveler during a pandemic is tethered to my knowledge of this historical precedent behind privileged travelers spreading disease to more marginalized and oppressed communities. That's why the following quote from the book Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond lives in my head rent-free. The importance of lethal microbes in human history is well illustrated by Europeans' conquest and depopulation of the New World. Far more Native Americans died in bed from Eurasian germs than on the battlefield from European guns and swords. Those germs undermined Indian resistance by killing most Indians and their leaders by sapping the survivors' morale. So as you can see, this apathy towards disease and travel has well-documented precedent. Traveling while knowingly sick has deeper imperialist implications than most people realize. And it's certainly not being a good world community member. I'll never forget when I matched with this clean-cut professional, entrepreneurial type guy on a dating app in Bogota, Colombia. When I asked if he was vaccinated, he told me he didn't need one because, quote, I taught my body not to get sick. Now, I don't know what kind of pseudoscience BS he was bought into, but I wasn't having any of it because he was traveling to Colombia unvaccinated during a pandemic, putting vulnerable communities at risk like a colonizer. I told him, I don't date Christopher Columbus types, and I unmatched him. When I think about how many people around the world have decided to behave this way while COVID is still evolving and making scores of people sick, sometimes permanently, I often think about this tweet I saw. The social contract for flatulence is stronger than the social contract for not spreading disease. It's depressing how true this is. It's incredibly disappointing how unwilling people have been to consider that masking is a very reasonable thing to continue doing so that we, one, don't all have to isolate, and two, more importantly, so that vulnerable people don't have to isolate and sacrifice life in public so the rest of us can live like we did before. Some Asian countries like China and South Korea have held masking as a cultural practice to a certain degree for years before the pandemic. There's no reason why we couldn't do it too. To this day, my partner and I are still adamant about staying up to date on all vaccinations, masking in public spaces, eating outside as much as possible, sanitizing, and minimizing contact with others. And it has paid off. Neither of us has gotten COVID this far. And you saw the map of all the places I traveled to, right? Neither of us have gotten COVID so far. We do not need a mandate to know that this combination of precautions is the best thing to do for the most vulnerable human beings. Every day, I think about how devastated I would be if I were disabled or immunocompromised enough that I could no longer safely participate in public life because everyone has given up on masking. This is the reality for many disabled and immunocompromised people. It makes me so sad that these people are treated as second-class citizens, who the majority of people are happy to have confined to their homes as long as they get to go back to living normal. So when it comes to criticizing myself for the public health risks of travel, I am pretty confident I'm doing the best I can to minimize my negative impact. And in any case, I'm certainly doing more than most people living either a nomadic or traditional settled life. Now, I want to talk about another negative impact of my travel that I'm far less confident about offsetting: my privilege. As I said before, my level of privilege in the context of the world is pretty high. Let's start with my whiteness. My white skin means I don't have to deal with the obstacles of racism that people of color, both in the US and around the world, must contend with. Being an anti-racist is an ongoing learning process, and far too many white folks don't commit themselves to that process. I'm trying to be a better world community member, and that means using my privilege to help people of color live better lives free of racial discrimination. Now, I want to turn my focus to a different privilege of mine: my language privilege. As a native English speaker, I was raised speaking the most widely spoken language in the world. English speakers make up about 13% of the global population's spoken languages. That gives me a significant advantage in the world. I have access to a lot of opportunities, both professionally and personally. That's not a privilege necessarily afforded to native speakers of most other languages. And I think we native English speakers often take that for granted. So I try hard not to do that, particularly because English speakers have historically asserted dominance by establishing structural and cultural inequalities between English and other languages. This can be illustrated by the proportion of native English speakers worldwide: 379 million people to non-native English speakers, 753 million people. There are almost 200% more non-native English speakers globally. While it's a widely spoken language, and we native English speakers can really luck out by being able to find English speakers all over the world to communicate with, it's good to keep in mind that not everyone wants to speak English. And I want to minimize my contribution to this English language imperialism. If I were in the shoes of someone who did not speak English and lived in a non-English dominant country, I would appreciate the efforts of visiting English speakers to communicate with me in my native language. And in my experience, I found that many people do seem to appreciate my efforts to speak their language, particularly in areas overrun with tourists. While I'm not able to dismantle these inequalities with my individual actions, I can at least lead by example and be the kind of world community member I want to see other privileged native English speakers be. For example, English-speaking tourists, particularly from the US and Canada, are not known for their willingness to speak Spanish in Latin America. This is very noticeable in Mexico. There, it's very likely you will witness North American tourists insist that people speak English with them. These gringos make no effort to speak Spanish or stumble through the language barriers to communicate, even when it's uncomfortable, and even if it's what non-native English speakers have to do to communicate with them. They will demand English. It's a very cringy display of privilege and English language imperialism. And I want to do my part to minimize my participation in such behavior. It's impractical for me to learn every language, but I find that pleasantries such as the local greeting, please, and thank you tend to go a long way. But because I've spent so much time in Spanish-speaking places, I've made a great effort to improve my Spanish through immersion. Plus, learning the language helps a lot with immersion into the culture as well. It's certainly not easy, but when the going gets tough, I remind myself, this is what people learning English have to deal with when they speak to native English speakers like me. Y la verdad, no quiero ser como esos gringos pamposos. Now, I want to turn my attention. Sorry, just moved slides on myself. Now I want to turn my attention to perhaps my most significant privilege as a full-time traveler. I am paid in US dollars. The truth is that for as poorly paid as so many people are within the US, and as much as US Americans struggle with the US cost of living, the US dollar is a powerful currency. As someone that gets paid on the US dollar, that means the cost of living in many other places around the world is far more affordable for me. But most people's wages and their local currencies are nowhere close to being able to afford the US cost of living. I just spent 3 months in Guatemala, where the minimum wage is 3,500 quetzales per month. That's the equivalent of $450 a month. But what's worse is the average monthly pay in Guatemala is actually closer to $400. That's almost 14 times less than the average monthly US income of $5,400. This is why so many people leave Guatemala for the States. 3,000 Guatemalans leave the country every day for work in the US. Not all of them make it to the US, but that's how many leave. And here I was coming to Guatemala with a US-based income. And I was far better off compared to the locals as a result. I might be a somewhat low-income earner in the US, but I'm a high-income earner in Guatemala. There's a trend in places such as Guatemala City and Mexico City of US Americans coming to town for a cheap live abroad experience and pricing locals out of safe and desirable neighborhoods in their own cities. This is gentrification. And I am a participant in this gentrification. I want to live in safe neighborhoods that I can afford, which means that I often pay for Airbnbs in the safest and most high-end neighborhoods. Because it's so affordable for me coming from the dollar, the people who rent out these Airbnbs to my partner and I charge more because they can, which may be of negligible cost to us, but it's a much more serious expense to the locals. I've participated in gentrification in numerous cities across Latin American countries. I struggle with how to balance my feeling of safety in a place where I'm foreign without pricing out the locals. My role in gentrification can be so ethically troubling to me that it leads me to question whether I should be in these places at all, especially considering that so many of these people do not have access to the same freedom of movement that I do. I can escape the difficult cost of living situation in my country, but they cannot escape the difficult cost of living situation in their country. And I'm pricing them out of their feeling of safety. That isn't being a good world community member. If my presence as a privileged foreigner makes it that much more difficult for locals to live, should I be traveling at all? Should I just go back to where I came from and never leave? No, I don't think that's the right answer either. Gentrification and the global wealth inequality are the results of capitalism. And no matter what your feelings are on capitalism, it is a system that is damn near impossible to escape. So my not traveling would not make this any better either. Because if I were to just stay in my hometown, St. Louis, I would continue increasing my rates as a writer and moving to better neighborhoods as I could afford to, likely pricing people out who have spent most of their lives in those neighborhoods. I would be participating in gentrification at home. The same goes for white privilege and English language privilege. I would just be less understanding of those privileges being surrounded by majority white communities and majority native English speakers. If I had never traveled at all, I would not have the same understanding of the wealth inequality on our planet, of white privilege, of English language privilege, and of US passport privilege. And I would not be able to sit here before you today and criticize my role in it all. If I'm going to be a good world community member, which depends in part on my cooperation for peace and justice, then I think I need to be committed to better understanding the world and the people in it. And I believe that humanity is better off when everyone can move about the world on equal terms, regardless of where they were born. To me, that seems to be the most peaceful and just agreement in regards to human movement. But because this is far from being a reality, the most I can do as an individual is to find ways to reduce my negative impacts as a traveler, explore ways to use my privilege to uplift marginalized folks, and share what I know with other privileged people. Some of the most important practices I've learned to become a better world community member are, first, people over things. Travel with the objective to connect with people, not with the objective of being able to say you've been to a place. Tourism often forces people into scripted and inauthentic experiences with a place that are completely disjointed from the experience of connecting with locals. After all, authentic connections are what really bring meaning to a place. I have formed connections with people all over the world, and these connections mean far more to me than the places themselves. People matter. Second, listen to and learn from marginalized people. There is a never-ending amount of history and politics to learn. When I open myself to learning about this from the perspective of marginalized people, I gain a better context for understanding the people in a given place. I was in Guatemala for their Independence Day this September. And once I learned that Guatemala's independence was simply a transfer of power from the Spanish crown to rich Guatemalan oligarchical families, I had a much better understanding of the basis of oppression that country was built upon and the frustrations of Guatemalans. Third, give money. It's one of the most radical and empowering acts of support. It doesn't need to be as ceremonious or overthought as we can sometimes be inclined to make it. Just give the money to people who need it. That's it. I have a monthly budget for giving out money to locals. I carry some cash with me and will give it to those who ask or otherwise look like they are in need. And fourth, commit to keep learning. It's an ongoing and never-ending process that can sometimes be uncomfortable because it can implicate us as perpetrators, but it's absolutely necessary for growth. So this is how I reduce my negative impacts as a traveler and become a better member of our world community. I am committed to unlearning imperialist attitudes, decolonizing my mind, continuously reshaping my worldview, and remaining open to feedback from marginalized people in the places I visit. I hope that my self-critique has inspired you to think about how you can be doing better as a world community member too. Because whether you travel or not, we are all part of this world community, which depends on the cooperation of all of us for peace and justice. Thank you for listening to me today. That is the end of my presentation.